this up in my headphones, Charles.
Turning it up. Hello, everybody, one and all. Welcome to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
I am ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, but not just any fantasy today. Because today we are continuing our epic journey through the Wheel of Time series. We are discussing Book 2, The Great Hunt by Robert Jordan.
Yeah, I'm really excited to get into this. This is my first read through the Wheel of Time series, as some of our listeners may already know. Charles, this is your second read through, which compared to many of the folks out there like Stephen and Jake who are on our Eye of the World episode, still makes you a little bit of a novice.
Yes.
Maybe one of the accepted is fair, right? You're not...
Very well said, Dylan. I definitely feel like an accepted versus I'm Fantology. Those guys are definitely full-blown Aes Sedai for sure.
Right.
But, we don't have them today. I do have my companion book within arm's reach, so I'm feeling okay. I would much rather have, Jake and Steven from Fantology, but you know what? We just gotta do this ourselves, we're ready. We read the books. We have a lot to talk about. And you know what? Let's start with the prologue, right?
Well, before we get into it, I want to make sure that I let any listeners know that if they haven't yet read The Great Hunt, that during these Buddy Read episodes, we do get into spoilers through the book that we have read.
Yep.
We will, of course, not spoil beyond The Great Hunt, because that would spoil it for me, too. And no one wants that. But we will have spoilers through the second book of the Wheel of Time series here. So if you haven't yet read it and you don't want to get anything spoiled, then now's a great time to set off on the epic journey to catching up to where we're at. But you might want to turn this down in your headphones for now and maybe come back
Spoiler
later.
warnings for The Eye of the World and The Great Hunt. But no other book in the Wheel of Time, just those two. So let's get into it. Let's get into this prologue. We have a mysterious POV character whose identity remains a secret, and he's attending this little gathering of dark friends, right, Dylan?
Right, yeah. My first reaction was, why are we at a dark friend cocktail party, Charles?
Right.
I was kind of amused by this idea. It's like, I don't know, Beelzemon just kind of getting the gang together, and it was like, if I remember correctly, our mysterious POV character was like, is Beelzemon himself going to be able to make it to this one? And
to this little shindig, the who's who of dark friends?
Yeah, it was a who's who.
It was a bit of a masquerade, right? Because they don't know the identities of each other, and they're, trying to, puzzle it out. He does recognize a few of them as Aes Sedai, which is quite alarming.
Right.
Learn about the Black Aja. And, I got some Voldemort vibes from this scene. Voldemort would do this sometimes. He would gather all of his buddies around, and they would all be wearing masks, trying to protect their identity, and he'd just be, scaring all of them. And I get that vibe here, it was kind of interesting where you're at the POV of just one of the guests at the Dark Friend cocktail masquerade party, and he's watching as Beelzemon speaks in their minds individually, and they are not enjoying it. And it was an interesting setup, interesting setting. Robert Jordan's creativity knows no bounds here, so... that was our cocktail party, and it kicks off this mystery of who is this mysterious POV character. The second time we've got a prologue with a mysterious character, in the POV slot. So, well, not wasn't a POV slot in the first one. It was the mysterious villain in that one, and this one is the mysterious POV character. So, we know, interestingly enough, that is turned out to be Ingtar, but we can get into that as we
Charles,
go on.
I think Ingtar was one of the other guests, if I'm
Oh, was he?
correct here. Yeah, there's a Shinaran soldier wearing a sky blue coat.
Yes,
Is what
because
I
the
have down
POV
here.
character is wearing all white, right? So we suspect
Right.
that he
And
might
it's
be one
Boars.
of. Yeah.
It's like the man who called
Who calls
himself
himself
Boars.
Boars, but that's how we just don't get his identity spoiled. So there are some characters that wear all white that we might suspect, but that's true. I don't think his identity is revealed.
Right.
Right.
And
that's a good distinction.
yes, feel free to tweet at us at the FTF Podcast One if you're one of these folks like those on Twitter of Time who know a lot more than we do. We're just doing our best over here trying to puzzle through this awesomely complicated series.
Yes, lot to digest here. Lots of opportunities to get things wrong. So,
and I'm sure we will, especially me when we get to the theorizing. Dylan theorizes on his first time read portion.
Yeah, Dylan thinks he's figured out where the 14-book series is going to go from book 2.
Well, I did. Yeah, if you haven't heard our Eye of the World episode, I did try to make a claim as to what the entire the entire Wheel of Time series is going to be about. So you can find that out there. But I have some more specific theorizing to do in this episode. But we will get there in due time, Charles.
All in due time. But in the meantime, we are chilling at Fal Dara. I mean, we were here for a good 25% of this book, and yeah, boy, did we stick around. What were your thoughts, Dylan, on this whole Fal Dara scenario?
I was a little bit confused at first because I remembered that at the end of the Eye of the World, it was like Rand decided to leave.
Yes.
And then it's like, it's been a month and Rand has not left. I guess we needed Rand to learn how to fight with a sword. You know, Lan had to teach him if Rand was going to believably be able to do some of the stuff he does later in the book. And then we also, I mean, here's what I'll say, Charles. I'm getting the sense from you, Charles, that you would have preferred getting out of Fal Dara earlier than 25% in. Is that accurate?
20 to 25% is just too long. And especially when it's Rand being like, I want to leave, but I can't because I don't want to. It's like, what? It's that circular thing. Like, yes, we're all worried about Mat's condition. He has this psychic attachment to this parasitic dagger. And that's kind of, I think, why Rand is sticking around for as long as he is. He's like, oh, I got to make sure Mat's okay. And everyone's like, dude, if you're going to leave, you should leave. And now he's like, I'm not going to let any Aes control me. But yet he lets more and more into his life. And it's like, hey, heads up, the Amyrlin seat herself is coming. This is your last chance before she's here. And he's like, oh, I should leave, but Mat. It's like, dude, what do you think you're going to do in Fal Dara? So, it was a long time coming, but we did get to meet a few characters along the way. I do say, speaking of the Amyrlin seat, I do like her quite a bit. I like that she had all these sea idioms as part of her character. It's like, yeah, she grew up with all these fishermen on boats and stuff, so she's like, oh, like a gutted fish. It's like, okay. Very interesting kind of character development. Little quirk for the Amyrlin seat.
Yeah, and I will say something I did enjoy about the Fal Dara time is I like when our main characters are all kind of together and able to interact with each other.
Yep.
That's something that I imagine will wax and wane as we move through the series, how much the characters are all together. Probably, I really don't know where that's heading, but I like Egwene a lot, and I'm interested in the Egwene and Rand interactions and relationship. I feel like we got to see a little bit more of that here, and then the rest
Yes.
of the book we basically don't get to see that again. Like I think once they leave Faldar, although they are near each other at points, they're either catching a glimpse of the other one from afar, or one of them's unconscious or something like that. So I did like we got a little bit of time with those two, and I'm sure I'll get to
Right.
touch on those two more. So yeah, just having kind of everyone all in the same place, it's nice to spend some time there. I'm with you though, Charles. I think we
Yeah,
could have
we did get
gotten
to
out of
learn a lot
Faldara
about
sooner.
Aes Sedai. We got to see the different Ajas and kind
Hmm.
of the political, internal office politics of the Aes Sedai, which was quite interesting. You know, there's the Reds, which are basically like very anti men because any man that can channel is a huge issue. So they've kind of committed themselves to seeing men as villains, and then that kind of conflicts with like the Green Aja, which has
Hmm.
lots of warders, and so you like there's all the back and forth, and that was interesting to learn about. Like this is kind of the first time we're exposed to those things, so that was interesting as well. We get more Padon Thane in the prison, so
Right.
there's all those things. But yeah, it's a lot of Rand running around, checking up on everybody, meeting everybody, until finally something happens where, the Dark Friends attack and they make off with the horn and the dagger. They steal them, and so the Great Hunt begins basically to reclaim the Horn of Valir and Matt's dagger.
Yeah, that's pretty much the big inciting incident of this whole thing.
Yeah, yeah,
There, yeah, there was that scene where basically like Rand happens upon all these dead bodies and the
yeah,
blood writing on the wall and all this kind of stuff. That
yeah.
was pretty interesting. I, th- yeah, I thought that it was something that probably, if you saw it in a bit of a more modern series, they would have spruced up the action a little bit around
Right.
it. But was an interesting scene, and definitely the fact that they set this tone of kind of business as usual and things are just kind of happening whatever for a while, then it feels like you know stuff starts moving pretty quick all of a sudden right after that, like, oh wow, all these people are just dead when almost nothing was happening for a while.
Right. It's interesting that you talk about the the violence versus like the action, and how like maybe more modern series would kind of play up the like exciting moments that would have led to this bloody outcome. And one of the things that I was kind of keeping track on throughout this series, and I think they like are most prominent like here at the end of Faldara and at the beginning of this kind of hunt chase situation, was I was paying close attention to the violence and the just like the scariness of it, because when we spoke with Fantology last time on our Eye of the World discussion, we were talking about, oh, what does the show need to do that's coming out on Wheel of Time to for modern audiences compared to the books. And Jake from
The upcoming
Fantology,
TV
yeah, the
show.
TV show, thank you. Jake from Fantology said that the show needs to like he's hoping that they embrace the scary moments of Wheel of Time, and I kind of internally was like, Wheel of Time's not scary. Like, what happens in Wheel of Time? And it's like, oh yeah, like all these people get like brutally murdered, and people get eaten alive, and there's
And
blood
there's blood
everywhere,
writing on the
blood
wall.
writing on the walls, like torture scenes, people hanging, like really graphic stuff.
The
The
Damani
Damani,
whole
but what
shtick, that
kind
we'll get
of
into that.
made me forget about it after all these years of not reading it was, like you said, how it was presented. We always see it kind of afterwards. Like Rand is walking in on this horrific aftermath. We're not getting like the blow by blow. And I
Right.
kind of see like Sanderson's inspiration for his violence as well, because I think his books are, it's like Mistborn, for example, is violent, but it's told in the same way as like this book in particular, because it's like you walk in and you see all the gore and the blood, but it implies what
Well,
happened.
here's I yeah, I can think of a particular scene in Mistborn: The Final Empire that I feel like you're referencing, but I
Yeah.
won't
We won't
I won't
spoil
say
anything.
details
Yeah.
around that. Uh, but I do. I get what you're saying, which is this like if things get extremely gruesome, Sanderson will not give you the gory details
Yeah.
in the way that someone like, let's say, Joe Abercrombie would very much be willing to give you.
Right.
Joe Abercrombie will tell you exactly what's happening in all of its awful details that we wouldn't go into on our clean show.
Right.
That being said, I think that Sanderson does go toward the blow by blow aspect of action scenes as much as anyone in the
Oh
genre.
yeah,
He
like
just
the
won't flesh
action
out like the
scenes.
blood
Yeah.
is doing this and the
Yeah.
like he'll if it
Like they're not
comes
like
to
screaming in pain or like
no
bleeding out. It's not like gore splattering everywhere. But there is like, oh, they clash, the punch, wham, like
right
like that kind of stuff is very exciting in Mistborn for sure. So that I guess is kind of the progression we've gotten towards. Like you said, like, oh, I wanted to see more of the blow by blow here, which Sanderson does give us later on in the history of modern fantasy. But he still kind of shies away from the gore, which is totally fine. It's like we're coming off of reading Abercrombie, which embraced every detail of everything. So it was just kind of like it seems tame, even though what's happening is super horrific in a lot of times.
right
Like all the implications of like, oh, these people were eaten alive in cook pots and eaten by by Trollocs. It's a very scary, terrifying thing to imagine. Like if you actually showed that in detail, it would be horrific. So I just thought it was super interesting how that kind of violence was balanced by Jordan and how that's kind of gone on to affect like authors' decisions in gore versus violence. It's really interesting, and I was just
gore
paying
versus
close.
violence.
I was just paying
Yeah.
attention to that in The Great Hunt.
Yeah, so there's basically two continuums we're working with here, right? It's like how gory do you depict the violence is one continuum, and then there's this other like how detailed are you in the blow by blow action of the fight. And if you think of something like Lord of the Rings as
Low on both.
way back, it's low on both. Yeah, it's more of this like above everything, like telling you a tale about a battle that had happened.
Yeah.
While then Robert Jordan is like, okay, well, I'm not going to give you the like this person stepped here and then this person did that, but and I guess not really, but a little bit more than like middle maybe of that continuum, right? Like the how much blow by blow do you get with Jordan? Well, if there's a fight scene, he'll tell you what you need to know, but he's not. It's not this like popcorn eating action sequence like a Sanderson novel.
Right.
And he's also pretty low down on how gory he gets, but he'll get gorier for sure than does Tolkien. So he's maybe like Jordan is kind of in the middle of both of those continuums, or like maybe like toward the lower end of the gore continuum, but higher.
Now, the Wheel
up
of
than
Time has
Tolkien would be.
always kind of been an interesting series for me. It just was written and published in a really interesting time in the history of the development of modern fantasy. So I was always looking at like, oh, like gore and violence are two things that I'm seeing kind of being experimented with here that have affected modern writers quite a bit. And like you said, it's kind of in between Lord of the Rings and a Sanderson Abercrombie. It's an interesting transitional
well,
work.
Abercrombie would be cranked up on both
On
of those
both
continuums
those
all the way to the top. Yeah.
For sure. So yeah, it was just something that really stuck out to me in these early moments, because Padan Thane does some really ruthless, like horrible things to innocent people, and even to his own, like to Thades, he like was doing horrible stuff to them, like crucifying them basically, which was a bizarre sight to think about. So I was just really interested in that. Anything else about kind of these early Great Hunt moments we want to touch base on here?
No, but you brought up Thane, and I just wanted to comment on something about Thane, which was, you remember, like, he's got that moment where he's giving away the horn.
Yes.
This is way later, but
way later. Yeah.
he's like got this internal monologue, and he keeps thinking of himself as a worm. He's like, yes, like a worm burrowing in. Do you know? Are you not?
I
He thinks it like multiple times.
I
Did this
kind of
not
remember.
stick out to you?
No,
I was just
I think Jordan was just trying to pull on imagery of dark fiend, dark friend, dark fiend kind of stuff, like worms and maggots and stuff. But it's like in the end, he just basically made his character call himself a worm.
right. Well, he does it a bunch of times, and I guess that's something that sticks out to me as kind of where Jordan fits in a little bit more in this talk about like fantasy writing and stuff like that. Is Jordan was still a little bit more of this like Tolkien style thinking of this like there are these evil people who basically like are so evil they don't even really think they're the heroes of their own stories.
Right.
Like in Thane's head, he's like, I'm like a worm. Like,
Right.
what can I say? And I feel like that's another step that Sanderson was like, okay, yeah, like I like having these people who are pretty much just the bad guys sometimes, and I'm all right with character like that.
Right.
But if I'm gonna give you what they think of themselves, they're probably not gonna think they are like a disgusting worm of a character. They will probably
Yeah.
think they're like doing something a little bit better.
Yeah,
than
there's a
they
lot
are.
of characters and types of characters that you can see what Jordan was drawing influence from Lord of the Rings, in so many ways. Like
Yeah.
Trollocs are orcs and
Right.
Fades are wraiths and all these other things. Moraine is Gandalf, but if I had to pick something for Thane, I would say Gollum. Kind of like he was.
Yeah, he reminds me of Gollum.
He's got that Gollum
But
vibes in certain ways, where he's like gone to. He was part of the shadow and escaped, and like you don't like he's kind of the wild card, but that's kind of where the similarities end. But Gollum is another one who's also kind of self-deprecating in a little bit of ways because he has
Right.
that like edge to him. Thane is
Yeah,
just
I
the next
guess.
level. Thane is like a bad
Yeah.
dude.
Well, that's the thing. I'm like, I feel like for me, it's hard when you put me in the perspective of a character that literally is like thinking of themselves as a worm. I'm like, people don't think of them. People think they're doing something good usually, and they're just mistaken. I mean, that's why someone like Abercrombie appeals so much to me.
Right.
Is this idea that Abercrombie, no matter whose perspective he's putting you in, no matter how terrible a person they may or may not be, he's going to try to justify, like they're going to try to rationalize or justify it to themselves. So I think it's like it makes a lot of sense for what Jordan's doing because he is kind of inspired by this more like good versus evil idea of thinking, but it's definitely different from how a lot of these modern fantasy authors are thinking about things now.
Very well said, sir. Um, where we are in the story, let's see. So we are beginning the hunt. We're chasing Padon Thane, and something very interesting happens, Dylan, where they all go
Oh.
to sleep, and this random crew, consisting of Rand, the Sniffer, Hurin, and your best buddy Loyal, wake up and find themselves separated from the rest of the Shienaran party. They were transported to an alternate world, and they're like, "What happened?"
Yeah. Well, they went to sleep near the portal stone, right?
Right.
Was the thing that happened.
Mhm.
So then they end up in this alternate world thing, and it's yeah. I mean, this was an interesting moment. It definitely made me more intrigued into the story where I was
Right.
like, oh wow, they're dealing with like teleporting to different worlds and stuff like that. That's not something we ever dealt with in the Lord of the Rings or
Right.
anything like that. It's like, okay, we're doing something a little bit different here, and I was having fun with that. I think I also liked that they get to this character Celine. A lot of
Yeah.
my theorizing is based around Celine.
Yes,
when we get there.
Celine just kind of enters the stage. She just kind of walks into the story and is like, "Hello,
Right.
everyone. I'm Celine. Let's go." So it's like,
Yep.
yeah, that in itself was interesting to me. Like this whole segment is like kind of felt it was interesting, but it was also kind of abrupt in the way it was. In the way like the events unfolded, it's like, okay, we woke up and we're in another world. It's like, what? You just hit me with that, RJ, right out of the.
You can't.
But I liked
Can't
it.
win with you,
I
Charles.
liked
It's
it.
either
That's
too
not
long
that's
or
not
it's
a
too
criticism.
abrupt.
It's like I think the Wheel of Time is at its best when like when there's all these things happening and Robert Jordan pushes his creativity. Like the things that get us further from Lord of the Rings are his best work, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And when he actually starts doing stuff, he starts to experiment. It's not until things start happening that we start to see new and interesting things. So I'm totally in support of these scenes. It's just kind of funny that it's like, oh, we're not in Lord of the Rings mode anymore. We're in like Bizarro World mode now. It's like, I'm ready. Let's do it. So and then with
it's
Celine.
something. Yeah, I think it's something that RJ does extremely well. This whole thing is very deliberately paralleling Lord of the Rings in a lot of ways, right? He basically has said in many ways it is a love letter to Tolkien's work, and I think that what he's doing here is he grounds us so well in this almost Middle-earth feeling world with these not a lot happening, whatever, status quo, that when he does just abruptly take us into this whole different world, it hits us even harder and it's even more interesting because it's couched in this like, wait, what? You can do this? And that's how the characters are feeling, Charles. That's how Rand is feeling when he goes through this. It's like, what just happened? How am I in another world? And we feel that too as readers, and I think that's when the reading experience is so good, is when you're having the same kind of experience as the characters, and I think we really do mirror Rand and my good buddy Loyal's experience here.
Very well
and
said.
And Celine just kind of happens upon them too, and they're like, "What is going on with this person?"
Yeah, like this story is really diverting, and I will say this is maybe one of the few times I actually am feeling like mirroring the experiences of Rand, because we'll talk about Rand a little bit more later, very shortly. But it's like, man, Rand goes through a lot that I'm not on the same page. But this certainly, these moments with the Portal Stone, we are definitely both taken by surprise here. And Celine during the scene, I got a lot of like Lady Macbeth vibes from Celine. It's like, oh, you should be the one with the horn, like he who has the horn is great power, and you should be the one that has it. You have to have the horn. Where it's like, okay, and Rand's thinking like, oh wow, like she's pretty. It's like, okay, he is a teenager, so
Rand, get it together.
Yeah, but Rand, you gotta start thinking here. Like,
yeah, no, I mean, it's fair, right? If I'm gonna be always pushing that they're teenagers bit when it comes to Quoth and Denai, I have to give Rand the benefit of the doubt a little bit too. So, okay, Rand, we get you're not picking up anything. I mean, Celine, to me, from the beginning out like this, she's bad news. Yeah. She is bad news.
Right. She like Robert Jordan when he writes, he's suspicious. It's a suspicious character, and I don't want to spoil what happens with Celine, but in these moments, certainly, if you're not suspicious of Celine, like, I don't know what you're thinking.
So right. Well, here's something that I was picking up on. Is only a couple chapters before we meet Celine, we have Egwene, wonderful Egwene, having these dreams about Rand. And I mean, who doesn't dream about Rand?
I know,
right?
he's
but
so dreamy
I do
and
get
tall.
Yes, right. Everyone wants. Everyone's dreaming about Rand. So but Egwene's dreams do feel a little bit special here, right, Charles. That maybe there's something a little bit deeper going on.
Well, it's mentioned in this book
dreams.
that Egwene might have these prophetic dreams. She might be the super rare version of Aes Sedai that can have some sort of prophecy in her dreams, but it needs to be tested. We need to find out still, but it was put out there in the ether that she might be able to do these things. So
it is out there in the ether, so I'm expecting more to come of it, and because of that, we have to take Egwene's dreams and what's coming up very seriously.
Mhm.
And seems like there's like a man with a mask, which seems like it's probably Beelzemon.
Yep.
But more interestingly, she sees Rand as kind of this. I think he's sleeping, like kind of helpless, and there's a woman standing over him that clearly wishes him harm, like is dangerous for Rand. And I think that comes only a couple chapters before we meet Selene, and Egwene's like, "Oh, who could this be?" And of course, Egwene has no reason to think, she doesn't know who Selene
Right.
is, but she's getting this sense. And then it's like, who's the next woman that
Standing next
Rand
to
comes
Rand.
into
Yeah.
contact with, and who's whispering like, "Go for the glory, Rand. Take the horn for yourself." It's like, okay, this person is just
Just
bad,
show
bad
me the
news.
horn. I want to see it. It's like, okay.
Right.
That's
So you want my theory,
yeah.
Charles?
Let's hear it.
Okay. So I feel like this is only one part of my many theories, but there's apparently a character who is daughter of the night, and Lanfear is the name, and she was Lews Theron's lover before Ilyena.
Ilyena.
Dude, we gotta grab
we do
that
have to
sound
grab
bite.
that. Ilyena.
Ilyena. So before Ilyena, there was Lanfear, and then Lanfear became Forsaken. If I'm tracking
So
all
far,
this
you're
correctly,
correct. Yes.
right? Okay, so I think all that's just facts. The theory for me is that Selene is Lanfear.
Interesting.
That's my theory.
Well, you've heard it here,
And-
folks. It's on record. This is Dylan's theory.
Yes.
You're saying that Selene is Lanfear. That's the theory.
Right.
Interesting.
I'm still working out if it's some sort of the wheel weaves bit
The
where
wheel
it's like
weaves
playing
as the
out in
wheel
the same
wheels.
way as it did. Yes. Like, I don't know if it is like Selene is like a reincarnation sort of shtick of Lanfear, or like actually Lanfear herself, but I do think that's what's
I
happening.
see.
And there is this moment where Selene is like she's getting asked what her name is, and she I mean, it's not clear that she did this, but it feels like she like made one of the servers drop a lantern or something like that. Like they're carrying a lantern or
Right.
something, and it made them drop it. So it's like, and then she's always disappearing, all this kind
Yeah,
of
she's
stuff.
disappearing.
So I do think, yeah, we'll see. I mean, you're doing a good poker face over there,
Thank you.
Charles. So I never know if I'm just making a total fool of myself when I'm doing
Only
this.
time will tell.
But yes, time will tell. But I have other theories about who kind of the equivalent this round of the wheel turning is for, like, which character is the equivalent of which past character. Obviously, Lews Theron is Rand. Like, I don't think saying Rand is like the next Lews Theron is a theory. I think that's essentially confirmed. I mean, how many times do we have to hear?
If
I
you
have
ask
one again,
Rand,
Theron.
he says
Yeah,
no, he's
Rand.
not. Rand's denying it.
He's a sheep herder.
I'm a sheep herder
He's
from
just
the
a
two
sheep herder.
rivers.
That's another soundbite.
Yeah,
that we
that's
should grab.
true. Yeah, that would be a good one. I'm a sheep herder from the two rivers. I'm done with Aes Sedai.
Oh, dude, that's
He says
Next
as he
episode.
follows an Aes Sedai around through a Waygate. An Aes Sedai he just
so
met.
much contempt for Rand.
Well, it's just kind of. I feel like we're so far past this point of like the fantasy protagonist. It's hard to kind of go back and like read Rand, who is the classic like fantasy protagonist of like,
Right.
oh, like I'm not acknowledging the fact that I'm 6'7" and super handsome and really good at everything. Like, I'm not the Dragon Reborn. I'm a shepherd from the Troopers. It's like, dude, look at yourself in a mirror. You're obviously not. Dude, you can
Yeah, I
channel
feel ya.
like you're not a shepherd.
It's tough. Yeah. I mean, it makes a lot of sense in the context. I think what this is where RJ was when he was writing this, and this is a kind of protagonist that made sense at that time. But it is very strange to go back from reading like Rin from the Poppy War
Yeah,
trilogy, which is like a ridiculously proactive, if nothing else,
right.
right? Character, very intriguing and complex in a lot of ways. And then, Rand has some complexity to him for sure, with the fact that he's got this kind of internal struggle while externally everyone views him as amazing and all this kind of stuff. But he
Right.
can be a tough protagonist when it comes to comparing him to some of these newer characters we're reading that do some different things we've never seen
Right.
before.
Without spoiling anything from First Law, I will say there's like Jazal as a character seems kind of like a response to a character like Rand, or it's like
Mm,
this this just like this idea of of this like, handsome proactive like this handsome like character who's like, "Oh, I'm not this person." Yeah, and then just being like all these other forces dragging them along. I feel like Jazal's just kind of like the response to like what a character like Rand would really be like. So it's
maybe.
in some
I mean, I want to spend time talking about first.
no, no,
There might be a lot of listeners
no.
I would guess there are a lot of listeners who haven't read First Law, so I don't want to spend too much time getting into it. But I'm not sure I entirely agree. I see what you're getting at though, with the not proactive. Neither are proactive. Both are kind of like,
And then the different ways of how Rand is like, I'm not going to be controlled by Aes Sedai. It's like this idea of like how a character is like put through the plot. How their
right.
plot progresses is interesting.
I see
But
what
yeah,
you're getting at,
we can
Charles.
we
Yeah.
can move past it. What I do while we're on the topic of Rand, the only other thing I wanted to talk about, and that might help us seg into the world of the Aes Sedai here, is just that how everybody loves Rand. It's like that's another thing about his character. It's like you have Min, you have Elaine, you have Egwene, and they're like, "Well, if you don't marry him, I will, and if I don't marry him,
Mm.
you will. Oh, none of us can marry him." You're like, "Oh, okay." Like, come on.
Yeah.
Everyone wants to marry Rand right now.
Yeah.
Like,
I
Min
hear you,
barely
Charles.
met the
I
guy. Like,
Well, yeah. That I'll say I said on Twitter not too far back that I'm more interested in everyone else's perceptions of Rand than I am in
yeah,
Rand.
that's well said.
Right. And I think I'm like very intrigued by the fact that everyone reacts to Rand this way. I I'm not sure. I guess like when I try to step back and I think about it, it's like okay, Rand has all those things you were naming going for him, where he's like uh, this tall, handsome, amazing at everything guy. So I get why some of the appeal might be there. He's already doing all these heroic things, and everyone keeps telling him that he like the whole world and its fate kind of circles around him. So I do get why there would be some appeal to a person
Yeah,
like
and he's
that, right?
Tavir, and he
And if we didn't get to
pulls people
see
around him.
right, and if we didn't get to see Rand's internal monologue, we would probably see him in the same kind of way. Because I know you're making all
Right.
those like those jokes, but they're very accurate about this, like how he's almost like whiny a lot of the times in his internal monologue, it feels like to
Right.
us. But if you were someone out in the real world and just saw the things that this guy was doing, like being amazing at everything and being ridiculously like good looking,
He's got a
it's
really
like fate
fancy
is going to turn
blade. He's
around
really
him.
well
Like,
dressed. He's holding
right.
himself well.
Yeah, he
He's
looks like a
yeah, yeah,
lord.
yeah.
Like, yeah, maybe people would react to him in this kind of way. I will say, like, we it's a kind of thing that looking back at a book that was published, nearly 3 decades ago, that it's like, okay, yeah, we don't need every female character to be in love with our protagonist. That does feel dated. I'm sure I'm far from the first person to say that, but that is how it strikes
Right.
me.
I think the thing that makes it interesting is the idea of being Taviran, and which is what Matt, Perrin, and Rand all are, which is like the whole universe of Wheel of Time is built around the patterns and the wheel of time and how it spins, and all these patterns are like it's a kind of a combination of destiny and free will, how they kind of battle each other quite a bit,
Mm,
and the Taviran just kind of smash it all and rework it and kind of affect destiny in that way. So the fact that he might do
mm,
something bizarro, like have these three women kind of, somehow pulled into his life just from like being
that's
from meeting
true.
him, it is interesting. But it does, like, to a modern reader, comes off like, oh wow, all the women characters love Rand. It's like, get over yourself. But it is interesting if you take a step back and think about like how this world is built and who Rand is. Like, get outside of his head, get outside of the lack of progressiveness about it, I guess you could say, and think about it from this perspective of like, oh, here's Rand like just shattering all of these threads and patterns and things and pulling people in towards him.
Yeah.
It's an interesting idea that only gets further explored in the series, but it certainly got Min, Elaine, and Egwene kind of trapped in it in some way. And their story, yeah, go ahead.
Charles.
I was
Yeah, no, you're just making such good points. I want
sure,
to
sure,
comment on
sure.
them before you make more good
Yes, talk
points.
about my good points.
So let's talk about your good point. Well, one of our first time tips that we got from one of the wonderful folks over on hashtag Twitter of Time was that it's okay for us to look back on it with our more modern
Hmm.
perspectives and to keep in mind that this was written at the
Yeah,
time
that was
it was
great
written in. So I
advice.
think this is one of those moments, and I think that was great
Yep.
advice. And I'm sure we credit the wonderful person for giving it on our episode where we talked about the first time tips. So definitely
There
check
were a
that out
couple
because I
people that
I feel
mentioned
bad.
it, but yeah, it was a
Right.
great point.
So yeah, awesome point. I think this is one of those moments, and I think when we take ourselves, like you were saying, out of this, like, okay, well, I'd prefer from a modern perspective that all three of these main like teenage girl characters weren't all in love with our protagonist just immediately. I do like you bringing the insight around like they are kind of bound to him through destiny in some way, and that like that's part of what's at play. Like there's just generations and generations and generations of the wheel turning in this way where things have played out a particular way with the like it's hard to say like the equivalent figures for each time,
Right.
I guess is the way to speak of
Okay.
them. And I'll say, yeah, well, I'm going to launch another theory at you
Okay,
here,
let's hear
Charles.
it.
Elaine is Ilyana.
Okay, interesting.
Like that's
Yeah.
the sorry, did I say
Ilyana. Yeah,
Ilyana?
but
It's Ilyana,
yes,
right?
I think so.
Ilyana. Elaine is Ilyana. I mean, there's so this I got clued into when there was like the Heroes of the Horn come and Otarin. It was like there's this guy Otarin, but like you might know him as Oscar, and that definitely is paraphrasing. But it was like they have these kind of different names throughout the
Right.
ages, and I was like, well, all the names they listed during that point were like kind of close. So I was like, okay,
They
well,
are
I'm going to
close,
start
yeah.
keeping an eye out for what names are close to what names. And you mentioned, Charles, how you were bothered by the fact that Egwene and Elaine have similar
Mm-hmm.
names. And I think that's not by accident now that I'm seeing
Mm.
this. so they want us to RJ I think wants us to think that Egwene's in the picture, but we've also been told, Charles, by Min that uh, there's a line that's like she's not for you nor you for her, at least not in the way you both want. That's Min to Rand. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
so I think that all this is adding up to me that Elaine is probably the Ileana equivalent for this round of the wheel
Mm.
turning. Egwene, I do not think is, and I think that Rand and Elaine will end up together. But, Charles, Asmin also notes in what seems like a joke that Elaine will have to share her husband with two other women, despite being queen. So
Mm.
I think that the other two women are Min and Egwene are kind of tied into this whole way that the wheel turns. So that those are the two women that will be kind of in the mix. I don't think it's going to be like they're all married or anything like that, but I do think that that's what all of that is getting at. So
But
that's
that's the
theory
whole
time.
point
I'm
of
Dylan.
this book. It's like, what is the solution? They all like them, so it's like, well, now what? you know, like maybe some of us will
Yeah,
get ruled out, maybe not. Like I said, I don't do this or do this, or I'm a queen or whatever. Like that's the challenge here. And no, it's very interesting. And that's like when I first read it, I had that same issue. Like you're like, man, like all these characters like him. So what's the end game here? Like, it's and it goes back to what I think a lot of people were telling us from Twitter of Time and all that is like everything's a prophecy, everything's like a callback,
right.
and even like you said, where it's like even Egwene's dreams, like, oh, you might have prophetic dreams. It's like everything Robert
You
Jordan
have
writes
prophetic
sounds
dreams.
prophetic, so and it pretty much is, and you just have to go along for the ride. I think if you've got a lot of theories, we might have to record another episode just of Dylan's theories at this point.
Oh.
keep
Okay,
the
we'll
books
save.
moving. keep the
I've been
buddy
trying.
reads
Yeah, I've been
moving.
trying to drop them
But
as
it
they
is
become
interesting. I
relevant.
do
But
like hearing them.
you
Yeah,
like
it is.
right? I'm doing my best. I feel like that's most of the people I've interacted with on social media who find out I'm reading it for the first time. A lot of them are like, "Oh, like let me know your theories
Yeah. And I appreciate that
as
you're
we go
drawing
through
from
it."
the source material. We might have to, you're putting all this work into. We might have to compartmentalize these into other episodes. Like Dylan's
Yeah,
theories
yeah, yeah.
after reading The Great Hunt.
Three books.
And we can
Yeah.
talk
Okay.
about it, talk about them more. Give
Yeah.
them time. I think that would be interesting. And yeah, people are asking about it. You gotta deliver. Um, so cool. All right.
Yeah.
Well, we'll
Okay.
revisit.
I'll refrain from too much theorizing for the rest of this
Okay.
episode, and
Okay.
then we'll try
You
to
can look out
we'll
for
try to
those.
give it to you all in one jam-packed Dylan theorizing episode. Hopefully, I didn't use up too many, but I'm sure I'll have more after the Great Hunt.
Yeah. Well,
So,
maybe after
yeah.
we read the Dragon Reborn, we can do it.
Or
Yeah.
sorry, after
Right.
Dragon
Right. Right.
Reborn. I said after the Great Hunt.
Um, so one
Yes.
thing I really want to make sure we talk about, because it's maybe my favorite scene in this
Ooh.
whole book, is the test of the accepted that Nynaeve goes through.
Yeah.
And I think we're pretty much at that point in the story. We get to see the White Tower and how that works with the novice and the accepted and the Aes Sedai and the dorms and like all the different Aes Sedai, is very interesting. And I've always thought the Aes Sedai and the magic system of the Aes Sedai and Sayadar and Sayadin is one of the best parts of the Wheel of Time. So I really liked these moments. But for me, the most interesting thing was when they were basically like, Nynaeve, you're super talented, but you grew up through the school of hard knocks. You got all these, you have these weird habits with your channeling. It's strong enough to make you an accepted, but it's going to kind of hold you back, kind of like this Gohan syndrome, where it's like you have so much potential, but you have to get really angry in order to access it. But when you do, look out, So that's kind of an interesting thing that happens with Nynaeve, but it's the test that I wanted to talk about because she goes through all of the trials. Um, each trial that she goes through is this different, like, what if scenario.
Yeah.
It's kind of tempting her to not commit to being part of the Aes Sedai. And that to me was so interesting. Like she has that moment where she's like, married to Lan and they have kids.
Yes.
And it's like, oh, you're the love of my life, Nynaeve, and we have a happy family. And she has to walk away from that. And there's
Right.
also the moment where she's back in the Two Rivers, and there's all the villagers need her, and they're like begging her for help, and that they're being abused without her, and they need her, and she has to walk away from them too. And it's this interesting theme of like the price of success, and
Mm,
kind of like if you want to be the best, that's your relationships are gonna be sacrificed, kind of, and like
right.
you can't have like a loving, committed relationship and kids and be an Aes Sedai. And that to me was the most interesting part of this whole book. I don't know what your takes on that were doing.
I would say to me this was the second most interesting part of the whole
Fair.
book, and I'll s- I'll say that was second to all those moments with the possible futures that Rand could have
Which we
had,
will get
or
into.
maybe not possible futures, but possible timelines. And I think that what we're touching on here is this, like, what makes RJ's writing interesting and so
Hmm.
special. Even like I've not seen a lot of this kind of stuff. These almost like simulation,
Right.
like simulation of potential lives, and
Right.
how do
It's
people
kind of
choose to
sci-fi,
process
but
those
very,
things.
very
And
embedded in
yeah,
fantasy. Yeah, it's really cool.
right. Yeah, and I love how RJ explores those things in this novel, and I think that how he does it through Nynaeve's potential, both like horrible things that could happen,
Yeah.
like the whole village goes to waste because you left them behind and having to confront
Right.
that. And like that was one of her biggest fears, but it's also interesting to think of the fear of, like, it's almost a FOMO,
Yeah.
right? Like the fear of missing out on a just satisfied life with someone that you really care about.
Very well said.
And I appreciated that fear was like she's going in and she's worried about spiders, and it's like that
Yeah.
that's pretty relatable, I think, for a lot of us. It's
My
like, oh
biggest
no,
fear,
this
you
thing's gonna
mean
show me
spiders?
my greatest fears. It's like spiders, maybe snakes, like uh, but instead we get one of the fears is just having to leave behind this potentially happy life full of fulfilling
That's so well
relationships.
said. And that's what's really interesting about Nynaeve, because she hates Moraine and she hates Aes Sedai. But then when it comes time to take the test, which is basically testing her commitment to becoming an Aes Sedai, right? It's like, oh, do you really want to be an Aes Sedai when you could have a loving relationship with Lan and have like a family and children and all these things? And she's basically saying, no, I choose to pursue being an Aes Sedai. And it's like, oh, would you leave your village to, like, you can't save your village if you leave? And she accepts that by passing that challenge as well. Really tough things you're kind of, I keep going back to Nynaeve, like she's accepting that she has this power and this potential, yet she doesn't like anything about the people involved in it. It's a really interesting line, but she commits to it all in. And these tests,
Hmm.
like this idea of having these like alternate universe scenario moments through the challenge of the accepted was like super impactful to me. It's like, okay, Nynaeve is all in. As much as she likes to talk smack about Moraine, she's committing herself to this world, and it shows you how committed the Aes Sedai are to the pursuit of like the White Tower.
Yeah, it's such an interesting point you make there, Charles, about Nynaeve. I I'm curious to see more of what's underlying Nynaeve's motivation
Mhm.
here. I think that Nynaeve is a character. I find Nynaeve one of the most interesting characters. I know she's someone who annoys a lot of people because I think her haughtiness. I understand why that is annoying and frustrating. I've said this kind of bit on Twitter too before, but so I hope I'm not repeating myself for anyone who's looking around. But I'll say that I think she's a character that has a lot of depth because there's this exterior presence she has to put up of having to have it all together and be an authority figure because she's someone who rose to this wisdom position of authority at such a young
Hmm.
age that she basically has to do that or she gets treated like a little kid and people don't respect her
Right.
authority. So she's had to learn how to put up this gruff exterior, but beneath it, you can tell that she just cares so much about the people
Right.
around her, especially the people from the village. That's
Yeah.
why that was the one of the big fears was that the village would be so negatively affected by her leaving. And I think she's not super in touch with her own motivations because of this. Like, she's kind of had to lie to herself. So she's telling herself, Charles, that she's doing it to get vengeance on Moraine. But I think underlying that is she's pursuing this to have the kind of power to protect the people that she cares
That's
about.
true.
And,
And what I also love
yeah.
about Nynaeve is, yes, she's like walking away from Lan and from her village in these tests, but she knows she's in a test, and it speaks to Nynaeve's power that she's like, I'll play along with these games. I'll walk away from Lan and the village in these scenarios, but I'm coming back. You know, you kind of get that vibe from Nynaeve where she's like, she's part of her walking away from them was her stubbornness of like, I'm gonna pass these tests because they don't think I can do it or whatever, or I want to show them what I can do, and I'm gonna get through it. So she does recognize she's taking a test, which, you know, kind of muddies the results, but she does commit. And I think it's this really interesting blend of, one, she's obviously bought into pursuing um, growing her power as someone who can
Mhm.
channel, and two, I do think she's also kind of proving it to these, you know, more traditionally schooled Aes Sedai that she can roll with the best of them. So it's always like been an interesting duality to Nynaeve's character.
Right, Charles. Yeah, that's all well said. I think there's a lot of depth to get into with her, and that's another
Yeah.
thing we could probably spend far too much time getting into. But these sequences are, yeah, they're part of what makes RJ's writing stick
Oh
out
yeah,
still,
these are
even
some of the
decades
shining
later.
moments for sure, and they parallel your favorite scene. Speaking of alternate scenarios, you want to kind of introduce us to your favorite scene in the Great Hunt?
Yeah. So my favorite scene, it might surprise no one that it's when they're leaving the the place with all the
The
Ogier.
Waygate and the
Right.
Steading and
Right.
mm,
Yeah. Well, I'm saying it's when they're leaving Loyal and all, well, Loyal's coming with them, but Loyal's whole clan.
right.
Um, so I think that it's it's the. Are you sure it's not when they're using the portal stone? Uh, it's the
There's when
Waygate.
they like remove the leaf off the thing and walk through it, and doesn't that trigger
Right.
all those alternate scenarios at that point?
Yeah.
That's the
Well,
Waygate
yeah.
when they
Either
remove the leaf.
right. Right. Either way, I'll say that it's all those future scenarios that play out for Rand as ways his life could have gone. And it has all these moments, like a bunch of them go the way of him ending up marrying Egwene in a bunch of ways, and I'm very. These like childhood friend relationship dynamics, or they end up together or they don't because there's some sort of thing that's making it really hard for them to end up together. I don't know, that just pulls at my heartstrings always, Charles. And I think that the Egwene and Rand relationship totally hits me in the feels in part because of that dynamic. I mean, it's and it's really interesting. It goes through all these different scenarios, and most of them it's like he ends up with Egwene, but there's always a sense that like something's missing,
Right.
and it's it's just very interesting to see all of these potential timelines that we could have gotten. And no matter what Rand chooses, if it's not pretty much the exact one that I imagine we're following in the main chronology of the series, there's like this sense that things are not going the way that they should be. And it even comes up later on where Rand's like getting this sense of how things should be. And I like this toying around with destiny, and it also just hits me in the feels to have these moments where it's like Rand lives out a full life with Egwene, and she kind of like helps him through the facts that through the times in which he's struggling with like losing his mind really,
Right.
and then like she passes, and he goes on to himself fight against like all the bad things that are happening in the world because Rand never got to be the Dragon Reborn, and then he dies too, and it just ends over and over again with this like what was it? It was like I win again, lose
Yeah.
Theron, or I have won again, lose
Yeah.
Theron. And I was listening to the audiobook of that, and that's an earworm for me, Charles, was this like I have won again, lose Theron. And I don't know, I think that it's such a touching moment in a lot of ways, and an interesting moment that's unlike the other things that we've read.
It's so true. And this is, again, RJ's creativity shining through here. Like, I think we take for granted sometimes when Moraine says for the millionth time, the wheel wheels as the wheel will, like that kind of stuff. Like, oh, the pattern, it's all in the pattern. It's like this idea of destiny versus, like, what you can choose for yourself and free will and all of that. And one of the ways that is explored in these scenes where you get these multiple timelines, scenarios over and over. This is the wheel turning. These are the different patterns and the different threads. And you get to see all the different ways in which these stories play out. And the one constant is that there is this relationship between Egwene and Rand, and there's some cases in which Egwene dies young, or that they get to grow old together, like all these like really interesting things, and you get to see like how that relationship plays out. And it's touching to see that the constant is that they do both really care for each other, and they're both intertwined together, they're both affected together
Right.
in some way, and that does invoke some touching emotions. And that just speaks to how
Right.
RJ kind of wove all of this into the wheel and the pattern, and it makes it kind of epic in a way when he does that.
Well, yeah, and Charles, I was trying to place this when I was talking before. It's like he gives us the opportunity to get the emotional gut punch of these moments that we never would get to have otherwise. And if this was a typical series where there's no like alternate timelines that are legitimately explored in the text, then we'd never get to feel what it's like for us as the reader to watch Rand and Egwene grow old together and one of them to die.
Right.
And instead RJ gives us all of these moments that like are just a fast track to making us feel these things if we're invested in these characters and their relationships. So honestly, RJ couldn't have crafted anything better to just like quickly hit me over and over again in the feels. Is like, well, what if it went this way? Wouldn't that hurt you, Dylan? It's like, well, okay, yeah. Well, what if she died really young? Wouldn't that hurt you, Dylan? Like, but they could grow old together. Wouldn't that be nice? But eventually they'll die, Dylan. They will. And I win again, lose Theron. Like, that's RJ. I win again.
Basically.
So, right. I've won again I love it. So I mean, that's one, my big theory, Charles, and was from Night of the World that Rand will succeed in all the ways that Lews Therin has failed. So this does help drive that home, I think, is kind of living through this over and over again, how Lews Therin has failed,
Right.
and how might Rand succeed after 14 books.
Well said. And we will have to wait and see. But it's promising. Betting that the protagonist is going to succeed is a safe bet. But
Okay. I mean, but I said, see, come on, first book, that's pretty good.
yeah. Well, we'll see what
In
happens.
all the,
We've got 12 more books to go, so a lot of theorizing to get to. But before we
right.
do that, the other thing I want to make sure we talk about is the moments in basically Kyrian where, who is to return but Tom Maryland. I don't. Were you surprised to see the return of Tom Dillon after we last saw
I
him
was not.
embracing a fade in kind of a sacrifice moment?
No, I 100% was
I didn't
ready
know if
for
I was
Tom to
gonna
return
like
at
spoil
his
anything by
soonest
saying like, come on, no
convenience.
one bought that he was gone, right? Like I didn't want to bring that up last time, but I had a feeling we were both like,
No.
dude, he's obviously not dead.
Yeah.
So no surprise.
Didn't for
But
a
were
second.
you surprised to realize that a character named Denna is in the mix?
Well, you're obviously referencing my my love for a character in Patrick Rothfuss's Kingkiller Chronicle, also named Denna, and yeah, I guess you could say I was surprised that there was a character named
I
Denna.
forgot about
But you know,
Denna, Wheel of Time,
right?
Denna. When I read it, I was like, oh, Dylan.
Yeah. Oh no, I immediately knew you were going to bring it up. I knew, right? I feel this is something I'm forever
Yeah.
intertwined. Probably at this point in the fantasy
Yeah,
community,
Denna's your
right?
Taviran.
With yeah, like Denna and I tied together for better or worse at this point. But yeah, this Denna, unfortunately, I mean, she got the. This is another like, let's look at it with a current lens, but also be willing to acknowledge it for the time it was in. Like, she got a woman in refrigerator treatment, which is like, that's a trope, is women in refrigerators where basically a female character is introduced and then they are killed just to serve the arc of a male character. And
That is
that's what we
exactly
got
what happened
here,
here.
honestly.
Again, we have to be reminded that this is a dated piece in some ways and ahead of its time in
Yeah.
others. And I think the Denna in this story is unfortunately on the end of feeling a bit dated. It's like, oh, here's this younger character who's in love with this way older dude, and they're in this weird relationship, and now she's dead. It's like, okay, well, glad you were existed to further Tom Maryland's arc.
Right.
Like the whole thing read really bizarre to me, and I was like,
Dated.
"Ay, like no
Yeah.
one's writing that in 2021."
No.
With it,
Yeah,
so interesting. I liked her as a character, like the idea
I
of the
know.
first like female. She's like, I'm gonna be the first, and then Tom's like, oh, I'll make her a bard or something. It's like, ugh. But she doesn't know it
Yeah.
yet. But she'll come around.
Yeah, no, it's weird because it's one of those things that was more surprising now, I think, than it would have been back then, where like now I find most of the authors that we read are very conscious of not doing things like this,
Right.
where they would be like, okay, I'm not you I just introduced this woman and she's got her own plans and her own potential arc. I can't just kill her suddenly to serve a male character storyline. That would be not good. And I guess RJ took me by surprise by this being a more dated work where that was a thing that happened all the
Yeah.
time. And I was like, oh, wow, like I was not expecting that. So it did hit me hard, I guess, but not for the best
None of the reason
reasons,
RJ
I
wanted you
guess.
to be hit
Yeah,
hard.
right.
We should have been like,
Exactly.
no, not Denna. We'd have been like, oh, interesting how fantasy kind
It's
of
like,
wrote itself in a circle here.
well, I was kind of like, no, not Denna, because what I'm trying to say, Charles, is like, I would, if I was reading something that was written this year, and I saw a character like Denna come in the mix, I would be like, well, you can't. Like, you have to be more conscious. Like, you could, but I probably wouldn't be reading the book if it was a book that hadn't gotten like good enough response where they don't do things like
Yeah.
this. You
No,
get
I
what I'm
get what
saying?
you're saying.
Like, so I kind of expect you can't just kill that character, but this is like this is why it's a trope, and this is why there's like this stuff happened before in the past, and RJ
Yeah, I
wrote
mean,
this in a different
RJ's
time. I
big
get all that.
breakthrough for his female character was a character that wore breeches instead of skirts. You know, it's like, okay, well, like
He has like a female Gandalf. Give him that
he has a
credit.
female, yeah, female Gandalf is a much better. But I think in his mind, the bigger one was like, look at this. But I think he just wrote Moraine because that was like an honest portrayal of a real character, and like he was just writing a good character. But for me, he's like, I'm gonna be progressive. I'm gonna put her in pants instead of skirts, and you're like, okay, like,
Oh
well,
God. Well, she ended up wearing skirts
she
in the
did end up
end.
having to wear
Anyway,
skirts for a little while there. That was kind of the rising action of her arc within this story.
come on,
but
man. You're you're better than that, Charles. I think that you can uh, you can give RJ a little credit, or I'll say too. Here's something. While we're trying to give RJ some credit for these things, I do appreciate. I know this is way ahead of where we're at in the plot or whatever. That he has the ladies go and save Egwene later
yeah, the
on.
girls get it done.
Like that, instead of I was ready for Rand to go in with his like 6'7", one true power wielding self and save the damsel in distress, but instead we got the
Yeah, I
ladies
did
got
kind of
together and
like
did it,
that
and I
moment where
appreciated that.
Rand, like in the corner of his eye, was like, "Is that Egwene?" And then kind of like had to focus back on what he was doing. You know,
Right.
like that was kind of a fun um, piece to it, where it's like, no, that couldn't be her. She's supposed to be in the White Tower. Like, she's not going to be here. You know, so that was a really interesting um, piece of it. Yeah, and then the you have Nynaeve, who we know is this kind of like nurturing, protective type, and she just filled that role so well in that final scene of saving Egwene, and this whole thing she had about justice, and you know
Oh yeah, I
they
grabbed the
touched a
quote.
bit on that, which I thought was really great too. I mean, Nynaeve's always stole the show when she was on stage for me.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, Charles, do you want us to like go a little bit more like through the normal plot progression here,
We can
or should
bounce
we stay
around
where
at
we're?
this point. I mean, I like the few things that I really want to talk about are the ending and all the ending pieces, and
Sure.
you know, I do have a lot of positive things because like it might sound like I'm a bit critical on RJ, but that's because I've taken all the good stuff for granted. Like he's the one of the best in the game, and one of the things I did want to compliment him on is the Damani, which I think is so creative and twisted, and it it hits me in a way that not a lot of other like fantasy magic systems or evil creatures do. Like there's something just fundamentally um corrupt and like
Right.
gut wrenching about the fact that something like a Damani even exists, that other like other fantasy characters, even in RJ's own world, don't live up to. It's like, oh, here's a horrible monster, or this is a demon spirit that's the embodiment of evil. It's like, yeah, okay, like I can picture those things and they're cool, but this is evil. Like the whole idea of like having the leash and the collar, and like you're
Right.
trapped and you're being tortured and you're being beaten down. Like it's so it's so twisted, but in a really creative, clever way. Like you know, like I just got to give props to RJ's creativity in these moments with the Damani. It's such a great counter to the Aes Sedai. You know, it's like, oh, you think you're on top of the world, you think you're the most powerful. Well, there's this really simple device that if it gets attached to you, you are at the mercy of someone else, and that person is very cruel a lot of times and is trained to treat you like a dog. You know, it's twisted.
Yeah. Yeah, it's super messed up. This is really hard for me to
Yeah,
read, and it's interesting, I guess, coming from someone who reads Joe Abercrombie's work and hardly bats an eye
yeah, exactly,
sometimes. And
exactly.
then, yeah, and in some ways, I guess you expect it with Abercrombie, and then something super twisted comes in this more high fantasy package with RJ, where he'll just bring out, like, oh, this awful situation where these poor girls and women are being treated like animals, and when I mean you couldn't have chosen a again, RJ with his I've won again, Dylan. Like, couldn't have chosen a better character to make me feel just absolutely terrible about the entire situation than Egwene.
Very true.
And it's totally brutal. I do think like it's like again one of these like she's getting kind of this like damsel in distress situation, but I think he saved it with having the ladies save her rather than having Rand march in and
Yeah,
save
and the
her. And
Suldam
I do
was,
think
was female as well, which was really interesting. And the Aes
right.
Sedai are at the position of being the super powerful ones. So I never.
Well, that's where
Yeah,
I'm
yeah, okay,
going,
go for
Charles.
it.
But
No,
finish
whereas like
yours
I see
first.
what you're saying, where like it could have easily fallen into the damsel in distress, but it didn't. And I think that's
Yes.
what increased the payoff of this like Domani world building
Right.
piece to it, is that you it didn't fall into that trope, and you weren't thinking
Right.
about that. You were more thinking about how dehumanizing is it to be leashed and forced to do things you don't want to do, and to give up your identity and
Yeah.
your free will, and
Oh,
for
yeah.
your whole
That's
life.
also well said, Charles. Yeah, I think that for a lot of reasons, RJ balances this extremely well because it's a super delicate thing to try to portray, and the fact that he did it so long ago in a way that like feels super twisted but doesn't feel like you can't. That still
Right.
delivers, I'll
Yeah.
say. That still delivers on what he's trying to do in a way that's effective. I think is brilliant. It's horribly twisted. It's so hard for me to read, and it's difficult to watch Egwene. She's like got these moments where she reaches for the knife, and her hand just starts like twisting and
Right.
contorting,
Right.
and she can't even do it. And I don't know. We were talking about how Jake brought up this embrace the
Yeah,
scary.
you
That's a
could make
moment.
the
It's
you
almost
could
out
make a
of
Wheel of Time show that's just like so depressing and gory and terrifying, but telling the exact same story, just changing the lens. Where it's like you don't want to, I don't want
yeah.
to, but you don't want to embrace all the scary. Like, let's keep it high fantasy, and
Well,
because you could really get bummed out with stuff like this. It's just
having seen things like The Ring and stuff like that, I was imagining that sort of like horror movie, like twisting of the
Oh yeah,
hand. You get
yeah,
what I'm
yeah, yeah. The
saying?
supernatural
Like,
kind of something
yeah,
fundamentally wrong about the effect of
right.
wanting to harm yourself. Yeah, is messed up. And then even like these little
So,
details of like, oh, other Dolmani like ratting out people trying to save them, or stopping people from
yeah.
trying to save them because they've been so beaten down and conditioned to be subservient. Things are just fundamentally wrong that are so bought in these moments. You're like, man, this is a really, like, I've never felt like a character was in more danger, just because I think in fantasy you have that problem sometimes where it's
Right.
like, oh, what, you don't think your main character is in danger right now? Like, he's obviously gonna survive. But in these moments, like, how long is she going to be like this?
Yeah.
Like, this is really, really bad. And you really believe that she's in trouble, and you don't know what's going to happen to her. It could be anything.
It
And that's just one of the really great moments of this book. It's horrible, but great.
yeah, hurts me in the heart.
The
I think I
stakes
would
were
have probably
perfect.
needed my bucket for
Yeah.
my tears for this
Yeah.
one. And I think that yeah, it's so painful to watch Egwene deal with it. It goes on long, and somehow it worsened almost by these moments where things aren't like she can just kind of have a conversation with
Yeah.
Min and just describe how terrible her
Yeah.
life is, and then it immediately goes back to being that terrible. Is so that somehow like makes it
Yeah,
feel
there's so many tropes
worse
where it's like, oh,
almost.
she's finally
And
reunited with Min. She can be rescued, but it's like you're allowed to meet
right,
Min whenever you want, because guess what? There's nothing she can do, and that's a
right.
layer of it. It's like this oppressive
It
nature of it.
well, yeah, it renders her even more powerless. And you touched on something great there, Charles, which is this Aes Sedai being the really powerful folks in this world, but they can be rendered so horribly
Hmm.
powerless by these situations. And to watch Egwene kind of be starting to come into her own with her power, and then have it all taken from her and be left powerless like this is really hard to watch. And, I was mentioning in our Eye of the World episode that what I think is really interesting about where I thought Egwene's arc is going, and I still think Egwene's arc is going, is she started as someone who has this desire to, like, a very, I think, like, good intention, desire to, like, implement her power in the world, but she didn't have any at all in the Eye of the
Right.
World, and she would still try. Like, she'd try to fight the Forsaken when she couldn't do really anything
Right.
about it. And she was plucky and intrepid, but she just didn't have the ability to do something about it. And just as she's starting in book
Yes.
2 of 14 to get to this place of like, oh, like, Egwene, you can do some things. Like, go for you,
Yeah.
good for you. Like, again, it's stripped from her, and it's just super hard. And I think that what I do like about where I hope this is building, and Steven said I would like the arc, so I'm going to say I'm probably on the right track then, because I think it's not just gonna be her getting rendered
Oh,
powerless
you're
over
gonna
and
love
over
it.
and over again. I don't think I'd like that arc, but I do think this is just another moment that is going to make the payoff when Egwene does become more powerful and able to actually do the things that she wants to be able to do with all of that courage that she has. I think it's going to make that awesome. And I'm looking forward to, I don't know how many books of this we're
Yeah.
going to have to deal with
I
before we
mean,
get
yeah,
there,
it's
Charles,
interesting
but
that
I
you
do
you
want
go
to get
back
there.
to Eye of the World and she's willing to, even being virtually defenseless, take on these great things, and then that really gets
Right.
tested through the Damani. And how great was the reveal that the Suldam, the oppressors, are channelers themselves and could just as easily be on
Yes.
the other end of the leash, but it's just this
Yeah.
propaganda that keeps them as the leash holders. Like, that's just such another
Right.
brilliant level to it, where it's like, even this superiority complex is totally fabricated because they're the same. And it doesn't matter. It just comes down to having power over somebody else. And that is just so, like, that to me was the best twist in this whole book. I was like, oh, now that is a twist. Where it's like they hate Aes Sedai and they leash them and treat them like dogs, but they don't realize that they have the same abilities. And it's only when that they put the leash on them, set the collar on themselves, that they got like super terrified and were like shaking and went from having total confidence and control to being like, please, anything but this. It was such another really interesting layer to the Damani. Like, if you didn't have enough reasons to not like them, that was kind of the cherry on top.
For sure. I think you make such awesome points there, Charles. It's really
Yeah.
poetic. And I think that this this idea is exemplified really well too in the way that Nynaeve treats the aftermath
Yes.
of
Yes.
this. Like, in some ways she tries to give them this kind of poetic justice moment of it. And we also have Egwene who, like, this is
Yes.
like, I like how, I guess one of the things I like about Egwene is among a bunch of not super proactive characters sometimes, like Rand, we get Egwene who's just super proactive
Yeah.
when she can be. And she's freed and she's immediately like, I'm going to choke this person out. Like, I'm going to end this
Right.
person.
She takes the leash.
Yeah, and she's basically trying to kill the
Yes.
person is what Egwene might have done. And it's hard not to it's hard to think that you wouldn't want the same thing if you were in her shoes. And then Nynaeve says to Egwene, "It's all right to hate them, Egwene. It is. They deserve it. But it isn't all right to let them make you like they are."
Yes.
And it goes to show that this difference between the two factions is more of a perspective thing and what they were trained and what they were turned into than it is anything actually based in reality.
Which
So,
reflects real
yeah,
life so honestly.
right.
Like, how many times have we seen this in history, where it's like, when you try and justify things like war and one nation being better than another, you can make those parallels here, and it's super interesting. And the justice that Nynaeve places on them, which is to leave them to their own people, let them find out for
Right.
themselves, and whatever happens happens. She's like, that was kind of cruel, but it's the closest thing to justice we're gonna get from all this. And I thought that was really kind of, you know poetic as well, and it's a theme we see explored a lot in like World War II movies and things like that. It's like these really
For
really
sure.
honest moments about just like oppressive peoples and society. It's really interesting. And yeah, I mean, there's other stuff that goes on in this book, something about a great hunt or whatever, but these moments really shone. The horn was lost and found and lost and found.
Yeah.
In the meantime, while all this other stuff was happening, like we had the test of the accepted, and we had the Damani. But yeah, there was also at the same time the plot of this. I guess it was a hunt, in this book called The Great Hunt.
Yes.
Which, I mean, I
Yeah.
guess that leaves us, with the ending. Lots of stuff happens. Was there anything in particular you wanted to make sure we touched on in these final moments?
Well, I do like Matt blowing the horn,
Yeah,
I
that was a
guess,
nice development.
because, yeah, it's another thing I've been told over and over again by you, Charles, and by folks on Twitter too, who are getting a sense for my taste of characters and what I like, that I will go on to like Matt. And I think that I finally got my first moment by the end of the second book where I was like, oh, like, good on you, Matt. Like,
He was the only one. I was asking this question, like, can
Right.
someone blow the horn, please? Like, even Pat on Thane, I was like, blow the horn, blow the horn, like somebody. And he's just like, one day I will be patient, and then I will have the dagger back, and maybe the horn too. You're like, okay, but finally, I was
like a worm.
So I was like, thank you, Matt, thank you. Somebody.
That's the moment when he's doing the worm thing. He's like, so yeah, good on Matt, I think. And I guess I thought after all of this that Rand would blow the horn. So if you want
Right.
to,
I think
that I
everyone
was
in the
wrong
book
about,
was expecting that as well.
yeah,
A lot of the like main characters that knew what was going on was like, he will bring the coming of the whatever, and he's like, okay, well, Rand's gonna blow the horn, and Rand was kind of pushing back on. He's like, I'm a shepherd from the two rivers, but
Right.
Matt was like, it's like a burn all of you. I was like, yes, thank you.
yeah, yeah, good on Matt. I always appreciate that proactivity, and I think that's something that what hopefully Matt's able to. I don't know what's gonna happen with all this dagger stuff, but once all this is under control, hopefully, then he can start like showing us his true nature, and we can start enjoying more moments like this
Right.
where Rand is, sitting there being all, I'm a shepherd from the two rivers, and Matt is like, I'm just gonna blow this thing.
It's like someone's got to do something. I like it. Like Matt oftentimes operates from the position of just being frustrated.
I
Where
feel
yeah,
him.
it's like that kind of he
I'm
kind of
with
wins
him.
over the people in that way a little bit. So yeah, that was a great moment. It's just a little spice to the world building. It's like you have other characters that do significant things. Like it's not just Rand doing all the fancy stuff. You get someone like Matt who gets to be the one that blew the horn. So it's fun, and I was all in on that. I thought that was great. Yeah, the battle at the end with Baal-Zaman, that was a little bit of blow by blow action from RJ. He goes through the
RJ.
names of all, but he tells it through like these poetic names of sword moves,
Yeah.
like eagle prancing on the fields. And you're like the tree sprouts
Yeah.
from the ground into the jumping tiger. You're like, okay, like that sounds cool. I can kind of picture what that is. Fancy sword moves, at least. And then you had the sheath the sword moment with his fight with Baal-Zaman too, which fulfilled
Right.
some kind of prophecy of being marked by the heron twice. And then the battle got projected into the sky and everyone saw it. That
Mhm.
was an interesting piece. So now, kind of like, word is out. Rand is the Dragon Reborn. So it's an interesting predicament we're in. What's your takeaway with the whole ending, and I guess with the Great Hunt?
All right. Well, we'll start with the ending, I guess. I think that I mean, it's mirroring the way that the wheel
Yeah.
weaves and the pattern in the sense that both books have kind of ended with this like battle with Beelzemon
Right.
shtick, and Rand thinks that he's defeated Beelzemon, and I'm assuming that we got a lot more reading to do that maybe he hasn't. So that part, yeah, we do get this kind of I think it's an interesting scene. Like I definitely enjoyed it, and I did feel like okay, yeah, like we've hit this beat before. The beat that I'm interested in,
Mm-hmm.
Charles, at the end is that Rand is finally accepting that he is the Dragon Reborn, and that's where we needed to get to. So I'm okay.
I'm
You
wondering if
are.
he really is
We don't.
accepting still at this point. Like he sees the brand and he's like, no, no, like maybe he's kind of lamenting it. I am not quite sure, but yeah, it is like
Interesting.
it's hard to deny it, But Rand, as we know, doesn't like to see things that everyone else in the
Well,
books can see.
I feel like I don't have it in front of me, but I feel like it's kind of like Moraine gives him this, like, dude, it is like I don't
Yeah, it's
want
like
like it's time. It's time to either say you're in on this thing or you're
he does
out.
proclaim himself to
And
be the
they're
Dragon Reborn. You are right.
right.
Yeah, he does.
Okay, cool. So yeah, he gets. I'm sure it's Rand, so I'm sure we will get lots of more internal monologue about his reluctance. And at the same time, we got this moment where Moraine said, "Put up or shut up," and Rand said, "I'm gonna put up. Like, let's do it." And that's the. I'm glad it ends on that sort of note. I know we get a little bit more like an epilogue sort of thing, but and the epilogue is kind of just like everyone starts, even more people start seeing how amazing
Yeah,
Rand was.
exactly.
But now Rand's finally starting to see it for himself. So let's hope that he'll be he'll be moving
Yep,
forward
yep.
from here.
So Rand proclaims to be the Dragon Reborn. Matt binds himself to yet another physical object. Like,
As one
yes,
does.
he doesn't care. He's like, whatever. Like, what? I'm bound to this for life. Okay. Like, what? Let's just add it to the pile of things. Like,
Right.
I've got a dagger. I've got a horn.
That's kind of that's kind of how I play D&D, Charles. It's
The
just like
reckless, like, yeah.
just reckless a
This will
bit.
affect me for
Yeah,
life.
is
Cool.
like chaotic neutral, chaotic good on a good day, and just yeah,
I
sure,
just
I'll
think
do
it's
it,
funny because
whatever.
usually, like, a character has, like, in fantasy, has like the one hook to them where it's like, oh, that's bound to you for life, and Matt's just kind of like making those commitments to
Fine,
multiple things. He's like, okay,
right?
so it's kind of funny to picture a character that has like all of these mythical
Yeah,
objects bound to him forever, and he's just like this kind of silly guy. So yeah, it's just funny that Matt's
well,
the one who blew the horn in that moment. It's like, yep, there we go. And Perrin is still doing Perrin stuff, He's the same.
Perrin is doing Perrin stuff. Have we said Perrin's name yet on this
I
recording?
maybe we definitely talked about him before, but yeah, he's the pseudo sniffer for a while. That's kind of what he's done at
That
this point.
yeah.
Um, and yeah, that's the trio. Um, so interesting to see how that continues, but yeah, man, I took away from this, there's some pieces that I really, really enjoyed, and it reminds me of a lot of the great things of Wheel of Time. This idea of, again, like, destiny versus free will, the whole creativity behind the Aes Sedai. I've always found super interesting. That we are introduced to the Black Aja, which is super interesting. Like the world gets even bigger with this whole other race of people with the Damani and everything. So, just looking forward to seeing this world continue to break open and see more of departing more from Lord of the Rings and more into RJ's kind of writing style. So no, I thought it was great. Looking forward to Dragon Reborn.
Right. Yeah. The big picture takeaways for me, I'd say, about this sort of its fit in the fantasy genre
Even the
and all
fit
this
in
kind of
its
stuff.
own 14-book thing.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'll say that I learned a lot here of how it might have influenced the Kingkiller Chronicle.
Interesting.
Outside of maybe just a character named Denna. I have no idea if that had any influence. If Rothfuss was like, I'm going to do this Denna character right. Because, both characters are pretty musical in their own ways and stuff.
That's true.
So, I don't know.
That's true.
Yeah, I don't know about that. But that aside, that whole bit with the great game.
Oh, yeah.
The
Game of
like
Thrones
had to
houses.
be right, but actually it seems like it had a much bigger influence on the way that Rothfuss wrote
with
that part of the Wise
invitations and
Man's
things like
Fear,
that,
with
and whether you accept
the
invitations or not, and not being able to stay neutral about it. I see that completely.
Yeah, so I felt like actually I was like, oh wow, like I'm coming to this after reading the Kingkiller Chronicles.
RJ brought a lot to the table that authors today are still exploring and putting their own voice in. There's so many different pieces that different authors kind of were drawn to and have explored in their own voice, and it's super interesting to see these moments and be like, oh yeah. I kind of see how this is like the breaking off point in the pattern, right? Where you have, these books came out and all of a sudden all these other authors were kind of, pulling pieces of it.
Yeah.
And it's super interesting to see where everyone's influences kind of lie. That's a really great point about Kingkiller Chronicles, actually. I didn't consider that, but it's totally valid.
Oh, yeah. It was the first thing I thought of. I mean, it's when I was seeing the Great Game stuff and the letters were coming and all this thing, it felt like Rothfuss really took his time with Rothfuss.
No
likes
surprise
to take
there.
His time with
No
things.
surprise. Rothfuss really took his time. You can stop your sentence right there.
Yeah. Oh god. Well, but I love the Wise Man's Fear and the way that they explore these things in a little bit more depth. It feels like, though it had to have been influenced by this moment to some extent, or it was a total coincidence. Yeah, so I mean that's just one moment. You start to see the ways in which both Wheel of Time has clearly impacted some of these more modern authors, like I was just mentioning, but also these ways in which it sticks out. And I guess I wasn't expecting to see as much in the way of sticking out when it came to Wheel of Time. I was ready for seeing this from almost a fantasy historian's perspective. Where does this fit in? And it certainly does, but it also has these moments like that. We talked about the Trial of the Accepted and the Test of the Accepted. I guess it's not a trial. And then those moments of the possible life timelines that Rand could have followed, and it was almost like that reminded me of. I forgot to say it. That reminded me of Mr. Nobody. If you've seen that movie, or if anyone listeners,
you
check
recommended
out Mr.
that
Nobody.
to me, but I never got around to watching it.
Okay, if you're like me and you really liked these alternate timeline lives that Rand could have followed, then check out Mr. Nobody. And the fact that I'm jumping to some movie, I think it was on Netflix last time I checked, but it might not be anymore. But the fact that that's the first thing I think of is some deep cut movie with Jared Leto rather than some other fantasy novel is telling as to how unique some of these storytelling devices are that Jordan is implementing, and it's super exciting to be getting something so fresh. As someone who's read a lot of work influenced by Wheel of Time, but not Wheel of Time yet.
It's true. Like there's a lot of really ingenious creativity going on in here that definitely keeps like RJ at the top of the of the influencers in fantasy, and
on the Mount Rushmore.
Yeah, on the Mount Rushmore for sure.
The fantasy Mount Rushmore.
He's a face on the fantasy Mount Rushmore, big time. Yeah, that is it, guys. I think we're good. I'm good if you are, Dylan, with The Great Hunt.
Yeah, I'm feeling good. We've got a lot more Wheel of Time to talk.
Very true. That's 2 down, 12 more to go.
Yes.
So we're going to be reading The Dragon Reborn as our next buddy read before taking a short little hiatus before getting into books 4 through 6. But, if we've got everything we needed to say for The Great Hunt, I think we're ready for that sweet, sweet outro music.
Oh, I didn't talk about Loyal.
Is there something you really wanted to say about Loyal?
No.
Okay.
I wanted to say that I don't have anything to say about Loyal.
Well, you've said it.
And to hit me up on social media if you want more.
Studying Sentai.
Oh, that's what I'll say. We got like 3 hasty drops at least in this one.
Hasty,
I think. Yeah.
Studying Sentai.
Loyal is yet to grow on me.
Well, he's
But you know what's...
Go for it. You say what you got to say.
What is growing on me,
Charles?
What
is growing on you, Dylan?
The Wheel of Time series and enjoying it with my wonderful buddy, my lifelong friend, you, Charles, and of course all the wonderful listeners out there who've been interacting with us. So keep on doing that. We're having a great time.
Could not have said it any better myself, Dylan. This has been a pleasure as always. Fans, thank you for listening. And if you're ready for us to plug some of our stuff, I think we can go right into that sweet, sweet outro.
Right.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. If you like what you heard today, reach out to us on Twitter. You can bug Dylan about Loyal and Denna 1 or Denna 2, King Killer Denna, Great Hunt Denna, go ahead and reach out to him. Let him know. That's over on Twitter at the FTF Podcast with the number 1 at the end. You can also reach out on Facebook and Instagram at the FTF Podcast. You can always send an email at the FTF Podcast at gmail.com. And Dylan, if they love us, want to support us, happen to be listening on Apple Podcasts, what can they do?
Toss 5 stars to our podcast. Just click on that Friends Talking Fantasy podcast page on your Apple Podcast app. Scroll down until you start seeing stars. Then ideally you would click 5 of those if you wanted to support the show. If you had a little bit of extra time and wanted to write a review, that helps us even more. But just listening is more than enough. Thank you so much. We really
Thank you so much for listening, guys. Thank you. Greatly appreciate it. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.